So I'm the founder of Do Big Good, and we're an impact measurement firm in Seattle. We focus on using participatory methods to work with beneficiaries and social entrepreneurs to identify their own metrics. And I'm going to be interviewing today Sara Olsen. So Sara Olsen has founded SVT Group in 2001. And since then, she's worked with over 100 unique clients internationally, has taught 5,700 individuals about impact management in person, and exposed at least 35,000 more individuals to these concepts via writing. She's a founding board member at Social Value United States and co-chair of the methodology subcommittee at Social Value International. She lives in Silicon Valley with her daughter and partner, and she's gonna be our introducer to topics of impact management, some of which some of this may be too introductory for some people in the room now that we know who's in the room. So we're going to talk a little bit and then do Q&A where we can go more in depth to your particular areas of question and interest. So I'm just going to start us off, Sara. And also, if you hear a clarinet in the background, it is because there is a clarinet in the background. So I will mute when Sara responds, but you are in fact hearing that. So Sara, greetings. I can't see Sara. I guess I'll see her when she speaks. I thought as just to start off, warm up, you could just say what is impact to you, since we're talking about measuring and managing impact. How do you define impact?
Thanks, and good to be here with everybody, hopefully with a little better lighting. So what's impact to me? I basically use the Impact Management Project and Social Value International's definition of impact. So I'm going to throw this slide up here. Impact means the change that happens for stakeholders that would not have otherwise happened. So looking at outcomes relative to some sort of a base case. And you got to tease out what amount of that change happened because of the entity that is the focus of the assessment, as opposed to what would have happened otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And when we did the preview for this talk, you also gave a definition, which is maybe a more introductory one, which is change for people that wouldn't have happened otherwise and that matters to them. And I thought that had a certain kind of poetic simplicity to it as well.
Yes.
So you still agree with that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and you know, the key aspect that is distinct from what we typically see in an impact map like this, or in a logic model, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, from what Mary just said, is the idea of understanding the importance of that change to the party who is experiencing it. And you can do that through weighting it. You can do that through valuation in monetary terms, which is what impact valuation or social return on investment analysis does. Or you can do it just by talking to them about, you know, what's important to you. And they say, this is really important, and leave it at that. But that is a key design insight that helps you understand what is the most important thing to the party who is experiencing it, and whether what you're trying to make happen matters to them and how. And then you can incorporate that into what you're doing.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about how you got into impact management and measurement? And I think that also is kind of an illustration of how things can go wrong, even with good intentions, when we do this kind of work.
Yeah, so Mary and I were talking before this session. I've been doing this work since really 1995 or so, and started my firm in 2001. So we've worked with clients who range from lots of startup sort of impact ventures to CalPERS, when they had a private equity environmental investment initiative that was, $600 million of their money, and a lot of different kinds of entities. But when I first was introduced to these subjects, it came from having worked in a social enterprise that was a project of a community development corporation based in Chicago. We were working with teenagers after school and bringing them in the door with free airbrush lessons. This was in the era of graffiti being really huge. That was the Bulls era with Michael Jordan, and he was known as Air Jordan. So this thing that we were involved in starting was called Studio Air. And kids would come in after school and learn about how you run a small business by running a small business, the main product of which was custom artworks that the shop would then outsource the mass production of onto things like t-shirts. So these kids would learn how to show up on time, how to work together in a team to meet a customer's real world need, applying their creativity to create a solution, how to calculate tax on the sale, and they get paid for each piece that we were making. So it was very developmentally beneficial, which was the purpose of the enterprise. And over about 5 years, we could see a path to breaking even and never needing any more funding, though we were a nonprofit. And what we really needed was $500,000 in seed capital, as it were, in order to reach that milestone where we would never need a grant again. Unfortunately, the funders that we could find, which was very typical at the time and still today, I think is pretty typical among foundation grant makers, would most of them only give for 1 year at a time. Most of them would give less than $15,000 at a time. And at the end of the day, what that meant was that forming adequate capital to get this thing through to break even was impossible. We had to hire a full-time staff person who otherwise wouldn't have been needed just to write grants every year. And that blew our budget out the window. So the structure of the capital was dysfunctional if the goal was creating social value. And the other problem was that those funders said that what they wanted to see was us growing our well, they didn't really care because they were just in it for 1 year. So first of all, the lack of interest in what was actually changing for the people whose lives they were purporting to, benefit was dysfunctional. The other part of it was that the one funder who did want to stay in for several years was the city of Chicago. But after 2 years of funding us, they said, we'd like you to grow your impact. And the way we want to see you do that is by doubling the number of teenagers who come in the door each year with no change to anything else we were doing. So it was very much by fiat, very much disregarding what it would actually take to deliver a meaningful social change for those individuals relative to the resources we had. And essentially what that meant was that tipped us into this situation where we were having to have extra staff. The break-even point was disappearing over the horizon. The teenagers no longer could tell that their efforts mattered in terms of keeping this thing afloat. And a lot of the social value that we were delivering when their work actually mattered to keeping this thing breaking even went out the window. And it was a very poignant and motivational example for me of how uninformed capital can actually erode impact in the name of having impact when the impact metrics are poorly designed. And that was just an indication of, I think, the relative state of development of this field of impact management, which has come really far in the last 25 years. So I appreciate very much that you guys are hosting this conversation, and I can tell that people in the room can run circles around what those funders were doing, even if you feel like what you're doing is relatively not perfect. Nobody's practice is perfect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a vivid example. So maybe we could go back to that lovely slide that you showed. And maybe just walk through what your process would be, given the example, the kind of case study of how you would apply this process to that business that you worked in, just to kind of illustrate for people how this table becomes a process and ends one with some metrics.
Sure. So what you're looking at here is an example of something that goes by many names, but really is all about this sequence. It could be called a causal chain. It could be called a logic model, an impact map, a value map, impact value chain, you name it. The idea is to not just understand the resources that go into enabling activities to happen that then cause an effect or a result, but also first thinking about who are the stakeholders who either are creating that activity, making that possible, or who will be affected by the activities that are happening. So starting there is an insight that over the last 20 years has started to become something we see becoming more universal, rather than starting with the money that's going in, or starting with what it takes to make things happen, actually backing up and thinking about who's involved and who is going to be affected first is something you see replicated across all different impact and environmental social governance reporting frameworks. And that has been an evolution over the last couple of decades to that place where that is becoming seen as really central. So you'd first want to understand who are the people who are affected by this entity's activities. And obviously in this case, for us, the teenagers whom we were serving after school were the number one most important intended beneficiary. And if you're going to go about something as though you're going to do something that helps them, you darn well better make sure that you're talking with them and finding out what's going on for them. And that's a cultural shift as well in mindset around, what is the whole point of impact measurement and management? Well, if you're going around saying that you're having a positive impact on a certain group of people, but you're not talking with them or you're not listening to them about what's happening for them, you're probably doing it wrong. So that's the stakeholders. The next piece is, what resources do stakeholders invest? And this might be in the form of money or space or intellectual capital, but certainly also time and willingness to participate. So all of those could be considered inputs. Some of them are quantitative, and you can include time of volunteers who are key to enabling the activity, and think about that as a quantitative input as well. Then you look at what is going on, the activities, and think about the outputs of those activities. This is really where things that an enterprise is typically already accounting for can be identified. And that might be the number of sessions held, the number of people sitting in those sessions, the number of products developed and sold. It may also include byproducts. So how many kilowatt hours of electricity did it consume for us to run our business? How many flights were taken? And then you'll be able to get to the outcome of the greenhouse gas emissions consequence of those flights. So outputs are things that you're probably already tracking somewhere. That is a summary of the activities in numbers. That is distinct from outcomes, though outputs and outcomes are quite similar. Sometimes they're the same thing, but the outcome is actually what changes for stakeholders as a result of the activities. So if you're going along this process, you want to think about, so what? We did those activities, we produced those widgets, so what? Did it matter? And that tends to help you tease out the answer to the outcomes question. What are the things that are changing that seem to matter? Then you need to think about what would have happened anyway, or have we displaced something by what we are doing? Is a problem simply moving somewhere else? And who all has contributed to the change? And once you have thought about that, and also thought about whether the change lasts and for how long, or does it drop off, that will give you the impact. So it's the outcome minus what would have happened otherwise, teasing out a bunch of considerations to get to the impact. So that's basically what the impact is. And in this case, what we wanted to see change for stakeholders as a result of the programming we were doing was that they felt more competent in their mastery of how you would have a conversation with a potential client, their own earnings, that they earned some income, the teenagers that we were working with, that they felt like there was a reason to stay in school and to learn academic subjects like English and math. And maybe that they felt able to go on and pursue a career in entrepreneurship, but at least that they would want to go on to higher education. Those were the kinds of outcomes that we were interested in. And we would look at what the trajectory for kids of the same profile would have been had they not had this program to go to tease out the impact.
Thank you. I'm going to ask just one follow-up question, and then I want us to go into Q&A. So along that chain, should people be creating metrics throughout the chain, or is the chain more a mental model simply to measure the outcome?
Well, you know, I mean, I think if you're going to try to manage your impact, it's helpful to not only understand what's changing for your stakeholders that matters to them or to you because you have informed yourself about the issue, but also what kind of resources does it take to drive that change. And so, yes, I think that it's helpful to understand your stakeholders and revisit your understanding of your stakeholders periodically. It's important to understand the resources you're expending in relation to the activities that you're undertaking and the outcomes that get caused. Outputs is often something that people can find useful data from, because outputs are easy to track generally. You're already tracking them most often. And sometimes they are a leading indicator of the impact. As long as you know that if you do certain things in a certain way, you may be likely to be causing certain outcomes. So then you can just track the outputs of those activities without having to go to all the trouble of tracking outcomes. However, it's important to check whether that correlation between the easy to measure, you know, products and byproducts of your activities and the actual change you want to see happening, or that may be material, is true, because that relationship may change over time, or it may be a function of whether the activity you did was well done, and it may not always be well done. So you can, I think, say that yes, you probably do need to track some things across this whole chain. However, you don't want to burn yourself out with too high a degree of complexity. So it may be that focusing on high quality leading indicators of the change and then validating those assumptions periodically is the right approach. And that, I know that's pretty abstract, but I think we should maybe talk about some exact cases in the work of the group here, and that'll bring this more into focus.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Sarah. So we'll do a bit of Q&A, and I'll let John tell us when we need to stop. I know we're going a little bit later in the hour than expected.
So while everybody else thinks, let me ask a leading question of Sarah. So having spent a little bit of time in higher ed, where we had lots and lots and lots of metrics, and we counted the number of students in the classes and how many people came in and what gender they were, and we didn't collect their email addresses, and we didn't contact them and see whether or not they actually got a job or whether they actually stayed in the field that they got a degree in. It seemed like the activity counting, being easy to count, often missed the point of the organization. Mm-hmm. So how can you engage with the organizations to actually come up with meaningful outcomes, or at least proxy for outcomes, rather than activities that are easy to count?
Well, I think that it's helpful to ground everything in a theory of change. What is it that the organization is trying to cause to happen in the world? And how does it think that's going to occur? And then periodically, such as, you know, many organizations will take time, maybe every year, but maybe every few years, to revisit their own strategy. And I think on the same schedule, it makes sense to revisit the theory of change that underpins your assumptions about what's going to cause the result we would like to see. And if you have that clarified, then it can make more sense why to track certain things. And then hopefully the information you're gathering can be reviewed by thoughtful decision makers in light of what is this telling us about our theory of change. But I think that a lot of times the discipline feels foreign around, you know, let's remember that what we're trying to do is cause certain positive social value creation here, and therefore we need to reflect every once in a while on the data we're collecting. Very often what just happens is people start going into check the box mode. Did I gather the data? Did I fill out the report? Yes, and file that away and not really learn anything from it. So it does take a cultural change, and it takes leadership to get bought into the idea that our focus isn't just on staying in business or creating profit, and then we do some things for marketing purposes to look like we care about social and environmental stuff. Our purpose is actually to create social value in some way, and profit making is a benefit of doing that. But let's get our priorities clear, and then let's manage as though that's true. And that takes time, and it takes leaders who are willing to carve out the time and reward their people for prioritizing that. But, you know, I think that everyone these days is thinking about how do we endure this crisis in a way that doesn't burn our human capital? How do we emerge from this prepared to be more resilient? You know, environmental considerations have proved, I'm seeing in some of the performance data on investments, to be a factor that shows that businesses are a little bit more resilient to the downswing in the economy right now. So there's growing evidence that attention to environmental performance is actually also an indication of resilience in other areas. So I think that we need to, there's this hashtag Build Back Better going around. And I think as we're all going through this crisis, this is an opportunity to reinforce and build competencies around truly managing the enterprise as though suppliers and customers and employees and communities matter, and to build the accounting systems that will back that up.
Sure. Elke, do you have a question?
I was curious as to, sorry, I need to turn on a light here. I was curious as to how, or I guess I don't, where does the data and the measurement differ between the organizations working on their goal versus the investors? So where's the disconnect in how people see this?
Well, I think that obviously investors have a different audience than enterprises have. You know, the investors have their own investors to answer to, who have various priorities, which may or may not be as mission driven oftentimes. And then if it's a case where the investor is the asset owner, that may be quite different, and they may be much more closely aligned to the enterprise's interests. But at the end of the day, I think the atomic level has to be the enterprise, and anything that gets accounted for in terms of impact performance needs to start there, and then build on that, rather than dictating something that's useful to the investor first. Just like, you know, financial performance analysis at the end of the day has to start with the enterprise, not with what the investor is trying to show to its own LPs. So I would just encourage confidence that that is the correct locus of attention, and the enterprise knows very well what they do and what they are trying to make happen. And so to kind of anchor it there, along with anchoring it at the stakeholder level of who's being affected in a material way. And the enterprise needs to know that and manage for that. Then things should flow from there, in my opinion. I hope that's answering your question.
As you were speaking, I was actually thinking if wherever the capital comes from, if the mentality is long-term or short-term capital, or as you had said, yearly capital, which is actually not the same thing as short-term or long-term capital. So I think it's definitely helping as the enterprise. You'd want to define what that capital is and what it means to the other person. So yeah, and
you know, if the capital has different priorities than yours, either don't take it or be clear what yours are, and manage with yours and then deal with them if you must, but don't let their priorities become yours if you can.
So for me, the organization, the enterprise needs to be accounting for their financials in some kind of model and have their cash flow projections modeling out what they expect. And in whatever that document is, there needs to be accounting for whatever your mission results are. So the expectations of outcomes should flow directly. If I put more capital in the front end, then out the back end comes impact of some kind that I can count in some way in the cash flow projection, right? So somewhere in there is another piece that represents impact. And if you come to an investor and say, here's our financials and we're doing hand wavy impact, then the end result of that is that I don't actually know what you're doing. And so if you can't count what you are doing, then maybe it's not an impact investment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that you're seeing investors recognizing that businesses that account for, that have an answer to what is the impact we are trying to create and how are we tracking whether we're doing that or not, are a better place to put your money than those who do not have that answer and are sort of waiting for someone to tell them what the priorities should be.
Yep, absolutely.
But I wanted to just show this diagram that we've been circulating in the COVID crisis response sort of stance that we're in. We've put together a 10-hour pro bono package that is something I'd like to just let you guys know about if you know any enterprises that might be interested in this, to help orient the management response that contemplates a balance between the urgent immediate term and the medium to long term, by thinking about the balance between finances and your community and your investors, your suppliers, and your environmental performance. So those considerations all need to be thought about as you decide how are you going to survive. And I think businesses that manage to balance between, okay, we've got to cut costs right now and we need to sort of staunch the bleeding, but who then also are able to hold in mind what are the ramifications going to be for our people and for our stance in terms of environmental performance, to make sure that those things are getting attended to, so that as we move through this crisis, we've maintained goodwill and supported the people as best we can, and we will emerge in a more resilient posture as a result of thinking about that stuff. And it's echoing, I think, what you're talking about.
Thank you. So John, what do you think? Should we, I know you had some other things on the agenda, but we're also at time and I want to respect that people might have dinners to prepare and whatnot. So what are your thoughts?
Well, so how many people want to continue asking questions? Raise your hands like that. How many people need to go do dinner? Raise your hands like that. One. All right. So I'm seeing people in the chat room. I think a couple of people are jumping off. I think if you need to jump off, please do. And those that want to stick around and have a conversation, we are recording this. And so Mary will distribute this to all the people that came in, and we'll try and connect you to things. Adrian, do you have a question you want to ask?
I don't know that I do. I mean, I guess my main focus of my work recently has been around developing dashboards, which I think a lot of people, I guess some people feel like they're very passé and they've been there, done that, and then a lot of people are still trying to figure out how they could pull together all the metrics to actually produce a dashboard. I'm very excited about the prospect and potential of doing that. People all over the spectrum in terms of their feelings about that. Just curious what role that kind of reporting, live dashboards, as well as kind of just.
So for me, if the company doesn't have a dashboard by the the coffee machine or by the bathroom, so that every day you walk by what the goal is and everybody sees it, then they're fundamentally missing something, right? And so, Sarah, how do you see getting from the 50,000 possible data points into some meaningful, this is where we're going dashboard for an organization to, on a daily basis, know whether they're winning or losing today?
I don't think this is a daily basis kind of thing, but I do agree with you that having it visible every day is very valuable. And I think that there's a balance. It's not one bottom line anymore, and it never was. And so we need to get away from that mindset that it has to be a single metric. But you know, humans are human, and we can only concentrate on so many things. So, you know, I think that we do need to think about what's our ultimate mission, and how are we doing relative to that, and how do we know, and how are we rewarding people for rowing towards that goal? What is our overall performance just in terms of good corporate hygiene around environmental and social factors? So it's just keeping our house tidy about that stuff. And obviously, what's our financial standing? Are we in a good, healthy place financially? And is that aligned with our other ways of creating value for other stakeholders, you know, the community, the environment? Those are the three big buckets. And I think getting increasingly sophisticated about how we understand the relationship between environmental and social value creation and financial performance is going to take centuries. And for any one business, it's going to take, you know, years of thoughtful attention to this, and we'll never be completely perfect at doing that. But we don't need to be perfect in order to just begin to map this stuff out. Let's all become B Corps, or let's all do a GRI report that kind of helps think us through the basic corporate hygiene stuff. And let's all define what our mission is and what our theory of change is, and determine a couple of metrics about how we can tell whether we're getting anywhere. And then obviously we already do our financial stuff. And let's report that in an integrated report so that we can sort of reflect on the relationship between our financial performance and these other things. I think that's what everyone should be doing. And SVT does that, though we can only manage to produce a report on that every other year.
Let's press on that a little bit. You know, you were talking earlier about a mechanism by which we needed to do some things, and that required us to add a bunch of people. So if I take a look at any of the classic impact reports, there's 50,000 little pieces of detail, and it's probably 3 or 4 months worth of someone's time to actually go through and look up what the pieces are. And so if I'm doing a dashboard, I can't do that on a regular basis. I have to focus in on some core small piece of something, as opposed to a gears report or some kind of GRI report where I have lots and lots of details about how I fit into this abstract thing that is a much broader snapshot about the world, right? So how do I distinguish the frameworks that people are putting out there, like the B Corp framework, which has lots and lots and lots of information, which are not functional for the business to achieve its impact?
So your point, I think, is well taken, that I think, again, I'll just repeat this, and you can see this in our impact report that you can get from our website. And it could be better, and I'd love to get people's feedback on what you'd suggest. But you need to know what your mission is, and you need some KPIs that align you with that mission and whether you're accomplishing it based on a theory of change and based on understanding who your stakeholders are and what your material impacts are. You do need to do B Corp. Let's just get over that you need to do something like that. You need to have the gamut of sort of good corporate hygiene considerations covered. It doesn't take that long. They work their butts off to make it as simple as you possibly can. You can do a GRI report where you pick out the most material things, whatever way you prefer. But if we are serious that we're going to need to become stakeholder capitalists, we have to all get over that. You're just going to have to invest in doing that. It's just time, And if we're not doing that, I think we're not walking the talk, and we should go home. And then you obviously have your financial accounts, and that's something everyone already does. So
if we don't check in the blue boxes, is what I just heard you say. I don't think you meant to say that, but
what's that?
That we can't be impact people if we don't check all the boxes. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that B Corp is sort of covering a basic level of insight into factors that really all enterprises can and should be accountable for. And then we think about
enterprise, how big is an enterprise?
What's that?
When you say enterprise, how big is an enterprise?
Well, SVT is about as small as they get. We're less than 10 employees. So
wherever Isaac went, he's one.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, that doesn't mean that he's going to enjoy doing it, but he can get an MBA student to help him do that. You know, it can be done. And the MBA student will want to learn how to do that because they know they need to learn how to do that to go forward in this industry, which everyone wants to be in, as far as I know. I have not met an MBA student in the last decade who didn't want to be an impact investor. Of course, I meet, you know, a self-selected group of MBAs, but I think everyone wants that.
Yeah. All right. Ed, do you have a thought? You're on mute, so there you are.
I should be back now. Hi there. Yeah, thanks for all that great information, Sarah. I really appreciate it. I just had a quick question. We talked a little bit about dashboards and a lot of the data that's coming out and things like that. And putting all these things together, I'm a bit more optimistic that at some point we will be able to measure impact along with, you know, key financial you know, returns and the traditional things that we look out for in investments. I'm a bit more of an optimist in that regard, but I wondered, the big non-profits or impact investors out there, what are the systems that they're actually currently using? What are the best systems out there to measure all and collect data?
Are you referring to technology systems or?
Yeah, technology systems. Are they all created bespoke, you know, in-house by companies, or do they use advisory, you know, firms, consultants and things like that? Or is there, you know, a product across the board, some sort of software that can manage these things?
Well, as you can imagine, by virtue of the immense variation in information that different investors and enterprises need about their own situation, it has been an incredibly difficult cat to skin to create a software that can accommodate all of that, and yet that also has a sufficient market to exist. So is there a dominant software that's out there? No, not yet. And it won't happen, I think, until there is a huge investment advisory firm, an investment bank that puts its chips on one thing, and they haven't yet that I know of. That said, I think for certain particular asset categories, like real assets, GRESB is now the dominant ESG reporting standard, and there's a platform that goes with that. There's a group that has built out a platform for community development finance that tracks certain specific things, and the name of it is escaping me right now, but I will try to remember what it is and send that around. And they may have gotten to a place where they have enough traction to kind of percolate into other domains besides community development. And there's a handful of other software platforms which allow you to select existing standardized sets of indicators and pick from among them, but then also customize your own in accordance with some of the more principles-based approaches. So for example, IPAR and SOPACT, they aggregate all of the dominant sort of existing metrics from SASB and GRI and B Corp and all this other stuff. But then it also allows you to figure out your theory of change and define your own unique metrics in accordance with social value principles that are governed by Social Value International. So those are capable of doing a lot of stuff. Are they perfectly user-friendly and like, does everyone love dealing with them? No, and they haven't like none of them has become the dominant player yet. But there are a number of solutions out there that are useful and interesting and being used to some effect by growing numbers of players. And IRIS, you'll see that they have this repository of indicators, but they aren't a software platform. They're really sort of a knowledge base, and they're trying to help guide users through the thinking. But they also are doing it with a fairly broad investor audience in mind as their primary user. And most mainstream investors right now, if they're willing to entertain this stuff at all, are thinking about what they want to make happen and not what all the material effects are. Though the material effects, which some of which may be negative, is actually where the learning is and where the advantage can come in terms of investment performance. But the way IRIS is designed right now doesn't really engage that issue, because that's sort of not the user group that they're speaking to hasn't come to that realization yet, and they don't want to turn people off with something too complex. So it's it ends up being that there are a lot of consulting, handholders and coaches and thought partners, and a lot of investment firms do take this in-house because you need to kind of get somebody who can become fairly sophisticated and understand what you're trying to make happen and kind of come up with the right solution for your group. But building your own technology is tough. Salesforce is also getting into this space. So it's still a bit of the Wild West, I would say.
Thank you very much for that answer, and I really appreciate the talk, and thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I've been putting a couple of the different standards that I know about into the chat. So those are things that people can take a look at. Anyone else have a conversation that they want to have before we call it done? Naketa? Tasha? Michelle? No? All right. Alex, you good? All right. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for participating in this.
My pleasure.
I'm hoping that we can put some materials together that are sent out to the group that came, so that we can spread this conversation into a more active conversation. So I know that Vero asked for the slides. If there's any reference materials that you think people can chew on, that would be good. So Mary, do you think there's things you want to share with people about what we're doing next?
Yes, there is. Thank you for asking. So this is the first in a series of 3 webinars that we're doing about impact measurement, and they're all on Thursday. So it's this Thursday, the next Thursday, and the following one. And our next session is going to be impact measurement in a time of COVID. So we have really not talked about current events, so to speak, that much today, but the second event will talk about that, and will feature a woman who runs a social enterprise and also a woman who is a fund-of-fund manager. So they're going to give a really a macro view of how they're measuring impact during COVID, and also some practical, even methodological changes about data collection. So that's next Thursday. And then the following Thursday is going to be meeting local to Seattle, but I imagine most of them are available remotely, consultants and experts that can actually help you measure impact if you're looking to measure impact as a fund or foundation. And so that's on the 30th. And all these events are on Meetup. So we would love to see you there, same time as today.
So thank you. Sarah, is there anything that we as a group can do that'll be helpful for you?
Well, keep doing what you're doing, first of all, because all of you sound like you're doing amazing things. And we've got this risky business offering. So if you know of any businesses that would be interested in 10 hours of free consulting to help them debug how they navigate stakeholder capitalism in their supply chain or in their among their human resources right now during the crisis, we are wanting to be of service. So I'll circulate that, and just keep the conversation going. Let me know if there's questions or things you think are interesting you'd like to share. Maybe also think about becoming involved in Social Value US, which is the United States chapter of Social Value International, which is an organization of professionals working to change the way society accounts for value and really walk the talk and account for stakeholder capitalism type values. So happy to send some more information about that.
So the thing that I work on is taking the 10% of the population that is federally accredited, allowed to do angel investing, and waking them up to the possibility that they could do it. One of the things that I would ask you to do is to wake up nonprofits to the fact that if they've got $5 million in assets, they're accredited, and that they could be investing their money in startups that actually drive change. And so if you want to scale change, the way to do it is to get an enterprise that's fiscally capable of driving scale. And so angel investment in those kinds of entities might be the solution to the nonprofit goal, right? So if you have anybody who wants to talk about how an enterprise or which is a nonprofit that has a mission wants to engage in the angel investing, I would love to have a conversation with them about that.
Great. Send us some information.
All right. Any last minute words from anyone? Okay. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope to see you next week. And let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much,
everyone,
John.
for coming.
Thanks for the invitation.
Bye.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you.
Right.